Hello friends! If you're not familiar with the Ukrainian context, you might think that the Russian Federation attacked Ukraine only in February 2022. But the most important battle against Russia actually started this week 10 years ago. 100 people died on live TV, but Ukraine won that battle and proved to Russia that Ukrainians cannot be controlled by the same oppressive measures that work so efficiently in Russia. Despite sharing the Soviet past, Ukrainians proved to be very different from their Eurasian neighbors to the northeast. The Revolution of Dignity, or Euromaidan, began with a message on Facebook from an Afghan refugee and ended with a massacre of the protesters by the police. It was a rally for the European Union, which ultimately defeated the pro-Russian government. It was a peaceful protest that was peaceful until the very end, until the pro-Russian president Yanukovych and his bastards fired at the protesters. Today, I want to discuss how a Ukrainian demonstration, which occurred 10 years ago, forced the corrupt president Yanukovych to flee Ukraine back to Russia. In November 2023, we commemorate 10 years since the beginning of the Revolution of Dignity. To understand what happened back then, we should first recall the political background in Ukraine of that time.
Razom nas bahato, nas не подолати. Razom nas bahato, nas не подолати.
Maidan in 2013 was preceded by the Orange Revolution of 2004. Back in 2004, the people rose against the fixed elections, and as the outcome of the protests, the first pro-European, reasonably modern and reasonably competent President Yushchenko was elected by the free and fair popular vote. I remember those days. That was something unbelievable. I was still a teenager, but I felt that it was a triumph of democracy. Unfortunately, the presidency of Viktor Yushchenko turned into a great disappointment. He wasn't able to build a coalition required to deliver what people expected from him. In addition, Ukraine was severely impacted by the 2008 financial crisis. During the following presidential elections in 2010, the choice was narrowed down to only two options: Viktor Yanukovych or Yulia Tymoshenko, and none of those options could be called acceptable for the country. On a personal note, this is when I decided to leave the country. In fact, I didn't even vote that time. I simply couldn't, because I knew that both of them would lead to a disaster, and I saw no future with politicians like this. That time, Viktor Yanukovych won and became the president of Ukraine, and I left for France. It was a disastrous moment for the country. You might be unhappy with the politicians in your country, but I assure you they are better than Yanukovych. After all, he was a petty criminal. Now it sounds like a joke, but he got prison time for stealing fur hats made of fur. In public toilets, he would lean over the dividers between toilet cubicles, grab the hat, and run away while his victims had their pants down and couldn't do anything. It's sort of ingenious in a way, if you think about it. But Viktor Yanukovych, being a criminal, brought to power his gang, which used every opportunity to make money. The personal enrichment, it's all what they cared about. By 2013, Yanukovych's mafia, the so-called family, was spreading across all spheres of influence in Ukraine. Banks, enterprises of the agrarian sector, media, courts, law enforcement, and tax offices, everything gradually ended up in the hands of the clan. The clan consisted exclusively of his close relatives and close friends. Some of these people did hold governmental positions, the other called themselves businessmen, but this doesn't change anything because in reality all they did was forcibly taking away private and state-owned businesses. Criminal organizations reached the highest levels of the state apparatus, and no other civilized country in the world wanted to have anything to do with Ukraine. Nobody wanted to deal with governments like this except for Russia, Iran, and you name it, other pariah states. The only question remained, what would happen sooner? Would Ukraine transform into a Russian client state like Belarus? Or would the country collapse because everything would be stolen by the president and his family? But we had hope. The European Union was the only force which we could rely on. It was the only force which could turn the tide. The long negotiations on the association agreement between Ukraine and the European Union, which lasted for years, were coming to an end. A few steps remained, a few signatures, and, for example, a free trade zone together with a visa-free travel regime would be a reality for millions of Ukrainians. It would also open a long but quite real path to the full European Union membership, a dream for so many Ukrainians. After meeting the criteria and narrowing the framework, the European Commission approved the draft decision, and the fate of the agreement passed into the hands of Ukraine. But unfortunately, a few days before the summit in Vilnius, on the 21st of November 2013, the government suddenly announced that the process of preparing for the signature of the agreement between Ukraine and the European Union was suspended. They said that Russia was putting pressure on us and that the agreement carried economic risks.
I have a long list of firms which are about to go bankrupt.
And it wasn't clear who would pay for these losses. Yanukovych stated that he needed better conditions from the European Union, and he offered to involve, guess who? Well, Russia into the negotiation. Yanukovych claimed that Ukraine will move towards Brussels and the European integration. He claimed that this was the only direction possible for us. At the same time, he literally started to move in the opposite direction towards Moscow. Then, on that day, journalist Mustafa Nayem published on Facebook, "People, just write in the comments whether you are ready to gather on the Independence Square in Kiev to express your protest against this decision of the country's leadership." As comments accumulated, Nayem published another fateful appeal which would become legendary, and this is the one comment that actually kicked off the entire protest movement.
Meet you at 10:30 p.m. under the Monument of Independence. Wear warm clothes, take umbrellas, tea, coffee, good mood, and friends. Repost in every possible way is welcomed.
On November 21st, 2013, about 1,000 people gathered on the Independence Square. Those people at the time did not realize their true power, and they didn't even know that their decision to go to the main square of the country would change its fate forever. Public figures and opposition politicians expressed their support. It was the very beginning, and that day was naively full of hopes for the better future of the country. The motivation to protest was not against Yanukovych or against the government. Those people probably did not fully realize the details and nuances of the free trade agreement, but they went out to express their disappointment. And first of all, it was a rally for Ukrainian dreams, for the European future of our country. The next day, people in other cities of Ukraine would take to the streets too. But then November 29 came. November 29, 2013. Unfortunately, the pro-European rallies all over Ukraine did not result in anything. On that day, at the Eastern Partnership Summit in Vilnius, Yanukovych refused to sign the agreement with the European Union. He knew that big protests awaited him at home. He knew that it would be very difficult or even impossible to return to signing this agreement later on. But despite all of this, he did not sign it. Without further comments, the Ukrainian president returned to Ukraine. On the next day, November 30, 2013, everything changed forever. The anti-riot police used force against peaceful people. Basically, before the summit in Vilnius, it was a peaceful demonstration of mainly students who wanted to see Ukraine as a free democratic state. But after the brutal attacks by the anti-riot police, the peaceful demonstration turned into a protest against the official government and its inhumane actions towards the demonstrators. Both Yanukovych's refusal to sign the association with the European Union and the lack of adequate explanation why he did so forced people to continue to resist and protest, and more people were joining the protesters. But the authorities made a decision to use force instead of words. Several squads of anti-riot police brutally dispersed protesters. The ruling party, consisting of criminals, adhered to its own time-tested criminal methods. But what was supposed to frighten and drive people back to their homes only forced them to leave their homes and go to the streets in solidarity with the victims of the police brutality. Even the church showed solidarity with the people, and the bells of St. Michael Cathedral alarmed for the first time in almost 800 years. Before this, the last time this happened was during the Mongol invasion, December 1st, 2013. The Maidan, the main square of the country, was cleared. The protest was dispersed. Dozens were beaten and detained. After learning about the brutal beating of children on the Maidan, people began to gather near the Independence Square. And already on December 1st, hundreds of thousands of people went to the Maidan. On the following days, the process was only gaining momentum. Similar Maidan gathered in other cities of Ukraine. People were coming to the capital from all corners of the country. A tent city was being installed on the squares. Barricades around the tent city were built. Among other, the protesters demanded the following: the impeachment of the president and the resignation of the government. In response to the popular protests, the ruling elites orchestrated the so-called anti-Maidan, including so-called titushki, which are basically poor young men who would do anything if you pay them little money.
А на данный момент проблема там в том, что людей собрали, люди сделали свою работу, а с ними не рассчитались.
This person complains that the ruling party didn't pay him for his participation in the pro-president anti-Maidan.
Allegedly, it was meant to show a different opinion of the people, but in reality, they were there just to provoke clashes and to discredit the peaceful nature of the Maidan protesters. At that time, the opposition politicians were trying to act somehow politically. For example, they tried to gather votes for the resignation of the prime minister. But at that time, he felt very confident and called the supporters of the European integration Nazis. You would hear this word from other Russians and Russian agents a lot in the following years. During December, there were several attempts to clear the Maidan by force. Again, The National Guards destroyed the barricades, but the protesters quickly restored them. Diplomats from the embassies of the European countries and the USA and well-known politicians from around the world visited the Maidan protesters. Among them, there was the US Deputy Secretary of State Victoria Nuland. The Russian propaganda, of course, used it as an argument that, you see, Americans are behind it. It must be an American staged coup.
Завтра
Yatsenuk awkwardly appeals to the people of Maidan.
Якщо куля в лоб, то куля в лоб. Але чесно, справедливо і сміливо.
The leader of the opposition, Yatsenyuk, although he tried to speak on behalf of the people, he was frankly not very popular among the people. This fact, once again, proves that people gathered not to support some politicians or political parties, but they gathered for the sake of Ukraine itself, for its people, for its future. In addition, the politicians did not always have much to offer to the people. It seems that Euromaidan was a big surprise to them too, and they simply did not have any real plan of action to offer. January 16, 2014.
Хто за, прошу підняти руки. Дякую. Прошу голову лічильної комісії оголосити результати голосування.
235.
On this day, the parliament voted anti-constitutional dictatorial laws. This voting took place in violation of all possible norms. MPs simply raised their hands, their votes were counted somehow by glance. The tension on Maidan Square was growing, but the current government still did not understand how bad things were going for them. The government thought that with violence they would change the situation in their favor, and they would solve any problems if they sent enough anti-riot police. They really couldn't come up with a better plan than crack on the protesters by passing the anti-constitutional laws. Those laws included the following: blocking of certain websites, punishment for organizing demonstrations, in particular installation of sound equipment or tents in public squares, punishment for defamation, punishment for threats to the police officers, prohibition of wearing helmets and masks in public, prohibition of moving in motorcades or processions, and selling SIM cards without ID. Well, I guess it might sound not so severe to you because certain Western European countries are a little less liberal than Ukraine, but for the context, Ukrainians would never buy a SIM card if they need to register it with their name, so Ukrainians value a lot their freedom, and something like registering your ID card with your phone number is considered in Ukraine as a violation of privacy. I think this is important to understand the cultural nuances of Ukraine. It's a normal practice in most of the Western countries, but in Ukraine it's a no-go. So the president signed all the provisions super fast and they entered into force in a few days. This was anti-constitutional, and in reality it meant that the ruling party of regions committed a coup and they basically seized the power. At the end of January 2014, the vote for dictatorial laws further angered the society, which was already exhausted by 2 months of protests. On the 19th of January, violent clashes broke out on Grushevsky Street, near the Dynamo Kyiv Stadium. Security forces attacked people trying to break into the building of the parliament. They attacked with tear gas, stun grenade, rubber bullets and water cannons. The Minister of the Interior expanded the power of the anti-riot police and allowed them to use firearms against the protesters. And Yanukovych announced his intention to impose the state of emergency. January 2022 holds symbolic significance for Ukrainians. This is the day of the first death on the Maidan. Serhiy Nikoyan.
Борітеся, поборете, вам Бог помагає. За вас правда, за вас слава і воля святая.
And Mikhailo Zhizhnevsky. For your information, they are ethnic Armenian and Belarusian, respectively. I'm making this remark because the Russians like to portray Ukrainians as some kind of ethno-Nazis, but in reality, Ukrainians are quite successful in building the inclusive political nation that encompasses different Ukrainians from different ethnic backgrounds. So Serhiy and Mikhailo died of gunshots. These names are included in the list, which would later be called the Heavenly 100. Also, the day before, in Kiev region, an activist from Lviv was found dead. Yuri Verbitsky, who previously had been kidnapped from the hospital and killed by the police. Tensions were growing not only in Kiev, but also in other cities of the country. On January 28, 2014, a wave of protests covered almost the entire country. People tried to occupy or even successfully occupied the regional state administrations, demanding the resignation of the authorities. There were huge rallies in support of Maidan all over Ukraine. Somewhere around this time, the ruling party started to understand that things were not going well for them and they needed to make concessions. The Prime Minister Azarov resigned. Typically, this type of resignation means that the entire government has to resign. But, strangely, the government was instructed to continue working until a new cabinet would be formed. The dictatorial laws of 16th of January were also scrapped. But these concessions were not enough to fix anything. Too many people had suffered and died in these 2 weeks prior to this moment. At the same time, a powerful information war was waged against Ukraine by Russia.
Протест в Киеве изначально не был только украинским. Западные эмиссары на площади каждый день. Все методы калька цветных революций.
The Russian propaganda comes up with another conspiracy theory.
Вот мы видим здесь Белград, 5 октября 2000 года, да? Вот здесь мы видим Киев, 1 декабря 2013 года. Но слишком много совпадений, которые заставляют задуматься о том, что происходит.
Совпадения? Не думаю. Кроме елки, революция сожгла не 1 миллион бюджетных гривен. А ведь это только ущерб городскому хозяйству.
Interestingly, I'll share a few personal anecdotes. When I was on the Maidan Square in late December 2013, there was a girl who was going around and speaking to people one by one, and she approached me and started complaining how dirty the protesters were, that they were littering everywhere. Back then, I naively thought that she was just a concerned citizen, but in retrospective, I know that she was an agent of Russian influence. A more shocking example happened in January 2014 when we were at a rally in Brussels next to the EU Commission and some unknown guy joined us, and at first he seemed like someone sincerely sharing our cause, but then he changed the narrative and started shouting in the loudspeaker the following phrase, "Say no to civil war." Which is very strange because in January 2014, no one thought of war. So it only proves that as early as January 2014, Russia was already shaping the information space to portray its meddling in Ukraine as Ukrainian civil war. Russia tried to discredit the protesters from the very beginning. For example, they published in Ukraine an article on December 13 titled, "Prostitutes from the bypass road moved to the Maidan." This is ridiculous, but this is a typical Russian strategy. Just say the worst, the most gross, the most disgusting things about your enemy, and somehow it works. Although, from the very beginning, The president stated clearly that his main motivation behind the refusal of signing the association agreement with the European Union was the result of the Russian pressure. Only at the beginning of January, the Russians announced their proposals and claims clearly and publicly. At that time, Yanukovych went to the Winter Olympics in Sochi to meet with Putin. They agreed on the second tranche of $15 billion, and the Russians promised this money in exchange for refusing the European integration. Putin was confident that Yanukovych would handle the protests. Again, Putin misunderstood and underestimated Ukrainians. On February 18th, a column of protesters went to the parliament building to remind about their demands. Despite the government's promises to guarantee the safety of the protesters, they were attacked by several hundreds armed gangsters together with the police. This is how the bloodiest days of the Revolution of Dignity began. After beating the demonstrators near the parliament, the police started clearing the central square. For the first time in history, the Kyiv authorities stopped the subway. They did everything to cut off those who were on the central square from the outside world. They tried to prevent them from escaping and prevent the wounded from seeking medical help. They tried to prevent the other people from joining and helping the protesters in the downtown. On the same day, a fire broke out in the trade union building. People were trapped inside and had to jump out of windows. That day, at least 20 protesters died and around 1,000 people were injured. February 20, 2014 was the most tragic day in the Ukrainian history up until that moment. Clashes continued between the people and the law enforcement officers. In the morning, it looked strange to see people with Molotov cocktails and wooden shields resisting against the police equipped with assault rifles. At some point in the morning, the law enforcement officers began to leave their positions. This inspired the protesters to move forward, and they took the abandoned positions of the police. Unarmed people advanced, not knowing that they were walking straight into a death trap. It was hard to believe that all of this was happening in reality. That in the center of the European capital, law enforcement officers were shooting at point-blank range at unarmed people hiding behind wooden shields.
Guys! We need help! Guys!
On that day, in front of the whole world, several dozens of peaceful demonstrators were killed. Each of them became a Ukrainian national hero, and they are known as the Heavenly 100. After the killing, the opposition leaders signed an agreement with Yanukovych. The authorities were given 48 hours to return to the 2004 constitution, which reduced the presidential power. They also agreed to form a government of national unity and hold early presidential elections not later than December 2014. In the evening, people gathered on the square to hold a memorial service for the dead. People were exhausted and angry, burned out, not satisfied with the agreement with the dictator. People demanded the resignation of the president. One of the protesters said,
Завтра до 10-ї години не виступити з заявою, щоб Янукович йшов у відставку. Ми йдемо на штурм зі зброєю. Я вам клянусь.
If by 10 o'clock Yanukovych does not announce his resignation, we will go on the assault. Yanukovych knew that despite the signed papers, he would not get away with his crimes. The surveillance cameras in his residence show that he started preparing to escape the day before, on February 19th. The ex-president hastily leaves Kyiv on helicopters and first goes to Kharkiv, then Crimea, and then escapes to Russia. Where else? In fact, the entire top of the government involved in his crimes also fled to Russia. This speaks volumes about who they really worked for. At the same time, the Russian troops took over the administrative buildings in Crimea. In fact, later they would mint a medal for the people who annexed Crimea, which indicates February 20 as the beginning of the operation to annex Crimea. In the coming weeks and months, taking advantage of the power vacuum created in Ukraine by the fleeing president, the Russians launched their invasion of eastern regions of Ukraine. And the war, as we know it today, began. But it's a part of a different story. 10 years ago, the student protests in support of freedom and democracy ruined Putin's plans of silently digest Ukraine and making it another Belarus. Seeing that he was losing his grip, he started the war against Ukraine. Although hundreds and thousands of people are killed and wounded in Ukraine every single day for nearly 2 years, I would argue that the main battle of today's war was won 10 years ago during the Revolution of Dignity. Putin is able to crack any dissent in Russia or Belarus. All he needs to do is to send police to the streets and his subjects would obey and follow their masters. Ukraine has proven that it's quite different. It would not tolerate any dictatorship, especially when it's installed by a foreign power. I would like to pay tribute to those who died for the decent, civilized future of Ukraine during the Revolution of Dignity. The Heavenly 100 can be regarded as first victims of the Russian invasion, which started 10 years ago. Unfortunately, they wouldn't be the last ones. And from a historic perspective, it's a drop in a bucket of millions of Ukrainians who died as a result of the inhumane and perverse ideology of our eastern neighbor. Thank you for your interest and your support for the Ukrainian cause. Please keep donating to your charity of choice. Your generosity makes a huge difference for people in Ukraine. Thank you and bye.